Hello everyone, I'm so glad you're here. Tonight, I'm here to help you unwind, slow down and let your thoughts drift gently into sleep. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and I'm honored to be part of that quiet moment in your evening. So before we begin, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. Now, get comfortable, close your eyes and let's begin. Story 1. The bartender and the night I barely made it home. There's something about certain nights that settles wrong in the chest. The kind of wrong that stays quiet at first, like a whisper buried beneath the rhythm of routine. This night was like that. A quiet, unassuming weekday. I had spent the early evening at a firm-hosted happy hour across the street from where I lived, a posh apartment downtown with a popular restaurant tucked conveniently next door. The place was familiar, comforting even. The kind of spot where the staff knew your name, where a table or a bar stool always seemed to be waiting for you. That night, I returned alone for a late dinner, feeling relaxed, unaware that something was about to go horribly wrong. I wasn't drunk, let's be clear about that. I'd had a glass of wine at happy hour earlier in the evening and had been home for hours afterward. When I walked into the restaurant, it was close to closing time, just me and a few other stragglers. I sat at the bar, not thinking much of it. The bartender was someone I recognized from previous visits. Young, nondescript, mid-20s maybe. He had a quiet foreign accent, Serbian if I remembered correctly. A guy I once went on a first date with had even pointed it out, saying there was some kind of geopolitical tension between their countries. It had seemed funny at the time. That night we might have exchanged a few casual words, nothing out of the ordinary. I ordered my favorite, steak with potatoes and a glass of red wine. Nothing extravagant, just something comforting to end the day. But halfway through my meal, something shifted. A wave of fatigue crashed over me, sudden, unrelenting. The kind of tired where even keeping your eyes open feels like a battle. It wasn't the normal sort of drowsiness, it was something deeper. Something that made it feel as if gravity itself had gotten stronger, pulling me down into my bones. I asked for a box to take the rest of my meal home. The bartender took his time retrieving it. When he finally returned, he said something that stopped me cold. "I'm walking you home," he told me. No smile, no suggestion, just a flat statement, as if he had already decided. I laughed politely and declined, but he insisted again, and then once more. I was tired, yes, dangerously so, but my instincts were loud. Something about the way he said it, the way he looked at me like he already knew I'd say yes, unsettled me. Despite how my legs were already betraying me, I refused him. My voice was firm. No. I took a few more sips of my wine, I had paid for it after all, and stood to leave. He looked surprised, perhaps even annoyed. He grabbed my glass, muttered something about coming with me, but I didn't hear the rest. I turned and walked out the door, determined not to let him follow. The walk to my apartment was short, just next door, but even those few steps felt like a marathon. My limbs were uncooperative, my balance shaky. By the time I reached the elevator, I could barely stand upright. When I got to my floor, the hallway stretched before me like a tunnel, the world spinning at the edges. I collapsed more than walked, crawled even. The memory is vivid, the coolness of the hallway floor, the struggle to hold the key steady in my hand. I managed to open the door somehow, though I can't remember locking it behind me. Everything blurred. The next thing I knew, I was waking up, slumped against the inside of my door. I had wet myself. I had never experienced anything like that before, not even after wild nights out in college. The shame was immediate, but so was the confusion. My body didn't feel like mine. My head was pounding, my mouth dry, and my thoughts swirled with questions I couldn't answer. I spent the entire next day trying to piece together what had happened. Maybe, I told myself, I was drunker than I realized. Maybe the wine and the happy hour drinks had mixed strangely. But that didn't make sense. I hadn't drunk that much. I hadn't felt drunk when I ordered the meal, and the wine, I hadn't even finished it. It was 2 days later when the memory returned, the bartender's insistence, the way he said he would walk me home, not as a favor but as a statement. The realization hit me like a stone. What if I had been drugged? The thought alone was terrifying, but the worst part was the helplessness. I had no proof, nothing concrete, just a gut feeling that screamed at me from the inside out. I stopped going to the restaurant, stopped walking past that side of the building altogether. For weeks, I altered my routine to avoid even glimpsing that familiar corner. I didn't speak of it to anyone, not at first. I buried it beneath everyday tasks, trying to forget how close I might have come to something far worse. Eventually, for work, I had to return. It had been 2 months, and I told myself it would be fine. I didn't see him behind the bar. In fact, I asked, casually, like I didn't care where he was. The bartender serving me said flatly, "Oh yeah, him. He's gone. We had to let him go." There was something in his voice, a hint of something darker. Disgust, resentment. He started to say more but stopped himself. Whatever it was, I didn't need to hear the rest. I already knew. I walked out of the restaurant feeling both vindicated and haunted. I had no idea where that man had gone or what happened to lead to his firing, but I was almost certain that I hadn't imagined any of it. And that's the part that still lingers. The almost. The uncertainty. The feeling that the world could shift so suddenly, so silently, and leave you doubting every step you took. I was lucky, I know that now. Lucky that I got through that door. Lucky that my instinct screamed louder than my exhaustion, and lucky that I walked away with only fear and not a darker memory I might never have recovered from. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I'm alone in a restaurant or when I walk past someone who seems just a little too familiar. It reminds me that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it smiles at you from behind a bar, hands you a takeout box and insists on walking you home. Sometimes it hides behind politeness and a perfectly poured glass of wine. Story 2, The Orange Peels in the Toy Box, in Salem. Some memories stick to you not because they were loud or violent or life-shattering, but because they linger just beneath the surface of understanding. They confuse you, and in that confusion you return to them again and again, wondering if you really saw what you thought you saw. I was no older than 4 or 5 years old when I first experienced something that I would carry with me into adulthood. A story that never quite settled into a neat explanation. It happened during an ordinary afternoon, one meant for naps and quiet, but it turned into something that would haunt the corners of my childhood long after we moved away. At the time, we were living in an apartment on the 2nd floor of a modest building in Salem, Oregon. The city, already heavy with whispered legends and a reputation rooted in the supernatural, seemed unaware of its history on bright afternoons like this one. Our apartment was small, but felt warm, the way early childhood memories often do, filled with toys, soft blankets and sunlit walls. That day, my mum had gone to work and my stepdad was the one watching over me. He was in another part of the apartment and I had been tucked into bed for a nap. As a child, I rarely resisted naps. I wasn't the sort of kid who fought sleep, at least not until that day. I remember lying still, the afternoon light filtering in through the window, when something flew across the room, not floated, flew. It moved quickly, purposefully, and landed on my bedspread. I blinked, confused, and stared at it. It looked like a piece of dried orange peel, curled, slightly crisp and strange. At that age, I didn't have the vocabulary to describe the feeling it gave me, but it wasn't fear. Not yet. It was more like surprise, like the world had just done something it wasn't supposed to do. Curious, I picked it up and ran into the hallway. I expected to find my stepdad laughing, maybe hiding behind the door, as if he'd played a trick on me. That would have made sense. That's the only thing that made sense. But he wasn't there. In fact, he seemed surprised to see me up. "You're supposed to be sleeping," he said, eyebrows furrowed. I tried to explain what had happened, showed him the peel, but he looked puzzled, even a little amused. "You must have been dreaming," he said, guiding me gently back into my room. But I hadn't been dreaming. I knew I hadn't. Dreams don't leave behind objects you can hold in your hand. Still, I returned to bed, slightly embarrassed, slightly frustrated, and more awake than before. I stared up at the ceiling, then at the window. I remember scanning the room carefully, my toy box, my shelves, my door, and then lying still, waiting. It didn't take long before something else happened. A second dry peel landed on my bed. This time it tapped me lightly before bouncing onto the blanket, and then another. I sat up quickly, fear crawling into the edges of my thoughts. I looked toward the window. It was shut. I looked toward the door, closed. My toy box, too far away for anything to be tossed from there. And then another one hit me, not hard but with intention. I dove under the covers, my heart pounding in my chest, listening as more soft taps echoed against the blanket. I watched their shadows land near my face. But when the taps stopped and I peeked out, there was nothing. No peels, no movement, just silence. That night I told my mum everything when she came home. My stepdad chimed in explaining what I'd said earlier. She laughed. They both did. They told me it must have been a dream, that I had a wild imagination, and maybe I did. But I also knew what I saw, what I felt. And dreams don't follow you into daylight. A few days, or maybe weeks, later, I was playing quietly on the floor of my room. I was building something with blocks or maybe rummaging through my toys. That's when I found it. Another peel. It was tucked deep into the corner of my toy box, behind some old stuffed animals. I stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. It looked exactly like the others. Curled, dried, unfamiliar. I ran to my mum, holding it up like proof of something sacred. This time, she didn't laugh. She looked genuinely surprised for a moment, but then her face settled into something neutral. She took it from me, threw it away, and told me again that it was nothing. But it didn't stop. Over the next few years, I found more of them, always in strange places, under the carpet, inside drawers, behind books, and always when no one else was around. I wasn't allowed to eat in my room, and we didn't even keep oranges in the apartment very often. Yet, somehow these little fragments kept appearing. I stopped telling my parents after a while. I knew what they would say, that it was nothing, that I must be imagining it. But I wasn't. I've thought about those orange peels for years, and I've done research, quiet late-night rabbit holes on the internet. I found a few obscure references to people burning dried orange peels to ward off evil. I don't remember where I read it, and I couldn't tell you if that has anything to do with what I experienced, but it stuck with me. The idea that maybe these peels weren't random, that maybe they meant something. There's one more piece to this story, and I hesitate to share it because it feels like the kind of detail that would appear in a horror movie. Our apartment complex sat on a known Native American burial ground. Most of Salem, Oregon carries that history, but this part was especially dense with it. People had said so. Locals avoided certain lots. My mum used to mention it in passing, how that area always felt heavy, like the land remembered something the buildings didn't. That was the only paranormal experience I ever had in that apartment. Just the orange peels. Just that strange, quiet phenomenon that never quite made sense and never escalated into anything worse. It wasn't violent. It wasn't loud. It was subtle, eerie, and persistent. And that, in a way, made it more terrifying. I used to tell myself that one day, when I got to heaven, I would tell Jesus that I wasn't lying, that it really happened, that they didn't believe me, but I was telling the truth. That thought brought me comfort when I was small, the belief that one day someone would confirm what I knew in my bones. Now that I'm older, I look back on it with a kind of quiet awe, not fear anymore, just wonder. I don't have an answer, and maybe I never will. Maybe it was something trying to communicate, or maybe it was a strange echo of something long buried beneath our feet. All I know is it wasn't my imagination, and I never forgot the way those dried curls fell from the air with no source, no sound, just presence. Story 3. The light above my bed. Some experiences take root not in the mind but in the body. Moments that go beyond explanation, beyond logic, and settle deep within your muscles and breath, in the way your pulse quickens or your voice falters when you recall them. What happened to me one night still feels unreal when I try to talk about it. My sister says it was sleep paralysis. My mind tries to agree, but my heart, and something deeper, disagrees entirely, because this wasn't like anything I'd ever known. Not then, not before, not since. I grew up in Colorado, just outside Denver, in a neatly lined suburb not far from a major highway. Rows of houses, clipped lawns, and the ever-present hum of traffic just a block away. As a kid, I would lie awake at night, listening to the distant rush of cars, that odd, soothing whoosh that never fully stopped. Our house was warm, comfortable, and ordinary, but my mind was never fully at ease. For reasons I still can't explain, I had this nagging thought throughout my childhood that I wasn't entirely me. Or not entirely human. I can't pinpoint where it came from. Maybe I'd watched too many movies. Maybe I'd read too many stories. But somewhere deep inside, I had this inexplicable belief that I was part of something else, something not of this world. That thought faded as I got older, but it never fully disappeared. Then, one night, it returned. Only this time, it didn't arrive as a thought. It arrived as an experience. I had been dreaming. What the dream was about, I couldn't say. All I remember is waking, not slowly, but sharply, as if something had snapped me out of sleep with a silent urgency. My eyes opened wide, and with that waking came a sensation I'll never forget. Terror. Not the kind that comes after a nightmare or a sound in the dark. This was pure, unfiltered dread, immediate and overwhelming. My body screamed at me to run, to scream, to leap from the bed and run until I couldn't run anymore. But something else, just as powerful, told me to stay absolutely still. I lay frozen in my bed, not because I couldn't move, but because I was convinced that I shouldn't, that something terrible would happen if I did. And then I saw it. Hovering just above me, maybe 3 feet above my chest, was a light. Not a beam, not a lamp. It was a square, perfectly geometric, made up of smaller white lights, each one glowing with an unnatural intensity. It didn't flicker. It didn't move. It just hovered there, silently watching. The hum came next. Low, deep, mechanical, but also oddly organic, like the purring of some unseen machine, and in that moment I realized something else. I couldn't hear the usual sounds of the night. The cars on the highway were gone. The fan beside my bed had stopped. Even the creaks of the house, the little night sounds that comfort us in their familiarity, had vanished. There was only the hum and that square of light. My panic grew, but still I didn't move. I felt like prey, cornered, exposed. Every instinct I had said to bolt, to cry out for help, but those instincts were tangled in fear. Something about that light told me I needed to be still, that to draw attention to myself would be dangerous. I didn't even allow myself to cry. Instead, I started whispering, softly, desperately, I want to stay with my mum. I want to stay with my mum, over and over like a prayer. I don't even know why those words came out. I was nearly grown. But in that moment, I was a child again, begging for safety. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the humming stopped. The light blinked out, not with a flicker, but as if it had never been there at all. My fan resumed its whirring hum. The sounds of cars drifted in from the highway again. The world snapped back into place, like someone had pressed play after a long, silent pause, and I felt myself beginning to forget. The sensation was immediate, the memory still vivid was beginning to slip like trying to hold water in cupped hands. That terrified me more than anything. I didn't want to forget. I didn't want to lose the truth of what had just happened. I turned on the bedside lamp and began to cry. Not loud, but soft, shaking sobs, not just from fear, but from the overwhelming relief of still being there, of having survived something I didn't understand, something that felt like it could have erased me. My sister came in later, after I told her what happened. She listened, she nodded, but I saw the doubt in her eyes. "It's sleep paralysis," she said. "You just had a really vivid one. Happens to a lot of people. And I've had sleep paralysis before. I know what it feels like. I know the rigid stillness, the panic, the helplessness. This wasn't that. I wasn't frozen against my will. I wasn't hallucinating shadows. I could move. I simply chose not to. Because something told me, in a way words cannot capture, that moving would be the worst decision I could make. For weeks after, I tried to convince myself that it had been just a strange dream, that maybe I had been half awake in that blurry space between dreams and reality. But the problem was I remembered it too clearly, the geometry of the light, the silence, the way my room didn't feel like my room anymore, and worst of all, the sense that this wasn't the first time, that I had been through this before and I had just forgotten. It was that realization that chilled me to my core, that whatever this was, it might have happened many times before, that the only reason I remembered this one was because I had resisted the forgetting. I had whispered my way through the moment and turned the light on before the memory could slip completely through my fingers. There's a strange loneliness that comes from experiences like these. You want someone to believe you, but you know how it sounds. You try to wrap words around the feeling, but the words never quite match. People nod, they say wow or that's wild, but you can tell they don't believe you, not really. And eventually, you stop talking about it altogether. You carry it alone, quietly. I still live in Colorado. I still hear the hum of the highway every night. But there are moments, usually when I'm lying in bed, just on the edge of sleep, when a wave of unease returns, when the silence outside grows too deep, when the sound of the fan feels just slightly off, and I wonder if it's about to happen again. I don't know what that light was. I don't know if it was alien or spiritual or some strange fold in the fabric of the universe. All I know is that it was real. I can still see it when I close my eyes. A white square made of many smaller lights, hovering just above me like a question I'll never have the answer to. And I hope, if it ever returns, that I'll remember again. Story 4, The Girl from Tinder. There's something quietly unsettling about the ways we meet strangers in the modern world. Not in the bustling energy of bars or cafes, not through friends of friends, but through glowing rectangles in the palm of our hands, where swipes replace conversations and connections begin in silence. This story isn't mine, but it's been told to me so vividly that I carry it like a memory of my own. It came from a friend of a friend, shared one night while we were sitting around telling scary stories, just slightly drunk, just slightly too open, the way people get when the sky is dark and the company is just right. We had been drinking, not heavily, but enough to loosen the edges of our conversations. It was late, and the topic had drifted into the paranormal. Each of us took turns sharing our encounters. Some stories were vague, strange sounds in the night or feelings of dread with no cause. Others were more intense, full-bodied apparitions, childhood hauntings, family curses. And then it came time for Dee, the friend who didn't believe in any of it. Dee had always been the rational one, logical, grounded, the type who laughed at ghost tours and shrugged off horror movies. But even he had a story. Not a ghost story, not exactly, but something that left a mark on him, something he had heard from someone else, someone who swore it was true. And that's how he began, slowly, like peeling back the first layer of a quiet nightmare. The guy in the story was a heavy Tinder user. That's how Dee described him, casual, nonchalant, someone who wasn't looking for love, just company. The dates were usually the same. Swipe, match, meet, talk, move on. But one time, he matched with a girl who seemed different. She was quiet, almost shy in her messages, but she had a sweetness to her that drew him in. Her profile pictures were soft, unfiltered, just her in natural light, smiling small. When they finally met, she looked just like her photos, maybe even better in person. There was something delicate about her, something fragile in the way she moved and spoke. The date was normal, even pleasant. They got coffee, talked about books and music, laughed at the same kind of dumb jokes. But as the evening wore on, he noticed something strange. Not about her exactly, but in the way she reacted to the world. She kept glancing at her phone, not in the distracted, bored way some people do on dates, but with anxiety. Her eyes would flick to the screen, then quickly away, as if she expected something bad. She seemed to shiver even when it wasn't cold. And when he asked her if everything was okay, she hesitated, and then quietly she said, "I don't want to go home." That's when everything shifted. He asked her why, and she looked away before answering. "My house," she said softly. "There's something wrong with it." She didn't elaborate at first, just said she didn't like sleeping there alone. She asked, almost too casually, if he'd come with her, just to sleep, nothing else. She was quick to clarify that. "I don't want to, you know. I just don't want to be by myself." He nodded, unsure but intrigued, and agreed. They drove to her house together. It was older than he expected, not decrepit, not haunted-looking in the way movies portray, but the kind of place where shadows collect in corners and light seems to avoid the windows. As they pulled into the driveway, he felt it, that low tug of unease, like stepping into cold water. But he followed her inside. They hung out for a while, watched something on TV, talked a bit more, and eventually, as the night crept past, they made out a little. Nothing serious, nothing intense. And then, clothes back on, they lay down on her bed and fell asleep, side by side. Or at least, that was the plan. At some point in the night, he woke up needing to use the bathroom. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, unnatural. He slipped out of bed and walked down the hall. The bathroom was small, and he didn't turn on the light, not wanting to disturb her. But as he stepped back into the hallway, he saw something that made him stop cold. There, just down the hall, was a figure, a dark shape standing perfectly still. At first he thought it was her. The silhouette was slim, unmoving. "Hey," he whispered, "you okay?" No response. The figure didn't move. Instead, it turned away slowly and began walking in the opposite direction. That's when he realized it wasn't her, and whatever it was, it didn't belong there. Heart pounding, he turned back to the bedroom, only to find the bed empty. She was gone. Not just out of the room, but completely absent. No sign she'd been there at all. The covers still neatly folded, her phone, her bag, gone. He checked the entire house, every room, every closet. Nothing. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Confused and terrified, he grabbed his things and left the house as quickly as he could. He drove aimlessly for half an hour, trying to make sense of it, trying to calm the racing of his thoughts. By the time he got home, dawn was beginning to break. Later, he checked the Tinder app, tried to find her profile. It was gone, deleted. Or maybe it had never been there to begin with. Dee, when telling the story, said he didn't know if the guy had imagined it all, but he remembered the fear in his friend's voice, the way his hands had trembled while telling it, and something about it felt real, too real to dismiss. We all sat in silence for a while after Dee finished. No one said anything, no jokes, no scoffing, just the quiet hum of something unspoken passing between us. And I remember thinking, even as I tried to rationalize the story, that there are things we still don't understand, shadows we pass in the night, people we meet who don't quite belong to this world. Maybe the girl was real, maybe something terrible happened to her, and her home had become a place where reality and something else intertwined. Or maybe she never existed at all. Maybe she was something that took shape just long enough to lure someone in, to pull them close, and then vanish again. Whatever the truth, one thing stuck with me more than anything else, the way Dee, the skeptic, told the story. His voice didn't waver, but his eyes did, like someone who had looked too long into something they didn't want to see, something that didn't care whether you believed in it or not. Story 5, The Thing That Touched My Hair. There is a particular silence that lives in the back of a parking lot late at night. It's not the peaceful kind of silence you get in nature, where crickets chirp and leaves rustle. No, this is a different kind. Still, cold. The kind of quiet that makes you suddenly aware of your footsteps, your breathing, and just how vulnerable you are beneath the yellow glow of half-dead street lamps. That kind of silence found me in a Walmart parking lot not long ago, and I haven't stopped thinking about it since. I've always been the kind of person who prefers night errands. It's quiet, less crowded, the world slows down. My job keeps me busy until late anyway, usually until around 10:30 p.m, so by the time I'm ready to do my shopping, the clock is well past 11. That night, nothing felt out of the ordinary at first. The parking lot was still fairly full, unusually so for the hour. I had to park all the way at the back, in the long stretch where the streetlights struggle to cast shadows evenly and the darkness creeps in just a little too close. But I didn't think twice. I was used to it. I stepped out of the car, grabbed my purse and began walking toward the store. About halfway there I felt it. A slight tug at my hair. Not painful, not aggressive, just odd. A soft brushing sensation as though something had fluttered past and caught briefly in my curls. My first thought was a bug. It was summer in South Carolina after all. Bugs are part of the air itself. I shook my head and ran my fingers through my thick hair, half expecting to find something tangled there, but there was nothing, not even a leaf. Just that strange tingling sensation lingering on my scalp. I shrugged it off and continued into the store. Shopping was uneventful. Groceries, toiletries, a few things I didn't need but threw into the cart anyway, as one does. It was close to 1:00 a.m. by the time I finally checked out. The lanes were slow that night, only one or two open, and everyone seemed to be moving in slow motion. I was exhausted by the time I pushed my cart back out into the parking lot, heading toward the farthest row, where my car sat like an island in the dark. There was no one around, just rows of silent cars and the occasional flicker of a faulty streetlight. I didn't feel scared, exactly, but I was alert. It's a kind of instinct you develop when you shop alone at night. You stay aware, even if nothing feels immediately wrong. I loaded my groceries into the trunk, got into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and drove home. By the time I walked through the door, my boyfriend was already asleep, and our dogs were curled in their crate, softly snoring. The house was quiet, still. I put away the groceries, tiptoeing around the kitchen in that careful dance you do when trying not to wake anyone. Then, finally, I allowed myself to sit down, just for a moment, just to breathe. I turned on the television, nothing special, just some harmless late-night trash TV, and lay back on the couch. I must have dozed off without meaning to. Not deeply, just that light, in-and-out kind of sleep. But then I felt it again. A gentle touch. My hair moved. My eyes fluttered open, but my body didn't react right away. I wasn't fully awake yet. I lay still, trying to understand what I had felt. The sensation had stopped. My scalp tingled where the strands had been disturbed. For a moment, I convinced myself that maybe I'd just moved in my sleep, that the weight of my curls had shifted naturally. But then it happened again. This time, it was sharper. A distinct pull, not hard, but unmistakably intentional. As if fingers had taken hold and given a slow, deliberate tug. I shot upright. My heart was pounding. Breath caught halfway in my throat. I looked around the room. The TV was still on, humming quietly. The door to the bedroom was closed. I could hear the faint snoring of my boyfriend behind it. The dogs hadn't made a sound. I was alone. I stood and turned on every light in the living room, then the hallway. I walked the house slowly, checking doors, windows, closets. Everything was locked. Every window latched. There was no one there, no signs of anything disturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. That whatever had brushed against me in the parking lot hadn't been a bug, but something else, something unseen that had simply waited until I was vulnerable again. I tried to settle myself, took deep breaths, brushed my hair out with slow shaking fingers. It was thick and tangled from the humidity of the night, so I took out the coconut oil leave-in conditioner, worked it through the strands, and tied my hair up as I always did before bed. A small act of control in a moment that felt anything but. Eventually I climbed into bed. My boyfriend mumbled in his sleep as I slid under the covers. I didn't tell him what happened, not yet. I didn't have the words and I wasn't ready for him to dismiss it as a dream. I needed to sit with it first, to understand what I had felt. When I woke the next morning, the first thing I noticed was that my hair tie was gone. I found it resting beside me on the bed. My hair, thick, curly, resistant to movement, had come completely undone in the night. But more than that, it was matted, badly, only on the left side, the same side where I had felt the pull. I got up and went to the bathroom, staring at my reflection under the harsh morning light. My hair was twisted into a mess of knots on one side, like it had been worked over again and again. I took my brush and started to untangle it, only to wince in pain. I leaned forward, trying to see the spot on my scalp. I couldn't quite reach it in the mirror, so I grabbed my phone and took a photo. What I saw made my stomach twist. There, along my scalp, were tiny red dots, specks of blood. The skin was inflamed, angry, and bruised in places. It looked like something or someone had gripped that patch of my hair with force and refused to let go. I didn't sleep well that night, or the next. I couldn't. The sensation of being touched hadn't left me. It had embedded itself into my skin, into my bones. Even though nothing had happened since, the silence in the house no longer felt safe. It felt watched. Every small sound at night became a question I couldn't answer. Was it the wind? A shifting floorboard? Or something else? Something still here? 4 days passed. 4 days of checking over my shoulder, of sleeping with the hallway light on. 4 days of my scalp healing, slowly, tenderly. But the memory stayed raw. I never saw anything, never heard anything, just the touch, and that was enough. I've told a few close friends. Most of them believe me. Some suggested it could have been stress, or some kind of sleep disorder, but I know what I felt. I know the difference between a tangle and a pull, between waking up groggy and waking up with your heart racing from something that felt real enough to leave marks on your skin. Whatever touched me that night didn't want to hurt me, at least not yet. It didn't pull hard enough to injure, but it pulled hard enough to let me know it was there, hard enough to leave a bruise, hard enough to say without words, I followed you home. And that, I think, is what unsettled me the most. Because if it could follow me once, what's stopping it from coming back? Story 6. The voice on the other end. It started with cake. That's the part I keep coming back to. That something so small, so innocent, a slice of chocolate mousse in a quiet cafe, could lead into something that would haunt my thoughts for years. The memory is still sharp. The kind of moment that imprints itself not through violence or spectacle, but through something quieter, something that doesn't make sense, no matter how often you replay it. I had taken my daughter to the mall that day, just a weekend outing, something we did from time to time when the weather was nice and the day felt lazy. She loved riding the escalators, pressing her face to the glass railings and pointing at window displays. We'd had lunch, walked through a few stores, and then, on a whim, I suggested dessert. There was this little cafe we liked, tucked near one of the exits, quiet, warm. Their chocolate mousse was rich and smooth, the kind that lingered on your tongue long after the last bite. We sat at a small table near the window. My daughter, ever focused, dug into her slice with the single-minded joy that only children possess. I was smiling, thinking about nothing at all, when my phone buzzed. The name on the screen made me pause. My sister. She was at work, and her job, strict, industrial, no nonsense, didn't allow phones in the production area. She couldn't make personal calls, not even quick ones. So, seeing her name pop up in the middle of the afternoon made my stomach tighten with quiet concern. I answered quickly, pressing the phone to my ear. Hello? It was silence for a breath. Then a voice answered, but it wasn't hers. It was wrong from the very first syllable. I can't explain why exactly, but it felt like the voice came from behind a mask. It was distorted, not mechanical, not altered in any obvious way, but oily, wet. It slithered rather than spoke. "Oh," it said, chuckling softly. "So you're just here, eating cake?" The words didn't land like a joke. They weren't playful. They sat in the air, heavy and strange. I froze, my hand tightening around the phone. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "Why are you calling from my sister's phone?" The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, it laughed. Not loudly, not maniacally, just a soft, steady laugh that sounded like it belonged in a dark hallway. Male? Female? I couldn't say. It had an androgynous quality, too high to be a man, too coarse to be a woman, and underneath it there was something else. Something cold and mocking. I stood up slowly, scanning the cafe. My daughter was still eating, unaware. The people around us weren't reacting. No cameras, no hidden microphones, no one laughing at a prank. Just the low murmur of casual conversations and the quiet clink of forks on plates. I ended the call. My heart was pounding. I stared at the phone for a long moment, then checked the call log. My sister's name was there. The call had lasted less than 30 seconds. I debated calling her back, but I knew she wouldn't be able to answer. Her job didn't allow phones, and even if she had her phone, she never used it during shifts. Something didn't fit. Something felt completely and utterly wrong. When I got home that evening, I called her. She answered casually, surprised to hear from me so late in the day. I asked her if she had tried calling me earlier. She paused, confused. "No," she said. "I didn't have my phone on me until just now. Why?" I told her what had happened. She didn't laugh. She didn't brush it off. She just fell silent for a moment. Then she checked her call log. "There's no outgoing call to you," she said. "Not today, not at all." I checked mine again. The call was still there, clear as day, her number, mid-afternoon. We tried to figure it out. Could someone have cloned her phone, spoofed her number? But who would go to that trouble just to make a cryptic call about cake? It didn't make sense. It still doesn't. I've replayed the voice in my mind 100 times, trying to match it to someone I know, but there's no match. Just that strange tone, that strange sentence. "So, you're just here, eating cake?" And the laughter that followed it like a shadow. I didn't sleep well for weeks after that. It wasn't fear in the traditional sense. It was more like a persistent unease, the feeling that I had been watched, that someone had known exactly where I was, what I was doing, and had chosen that exact moment to reach out. Why? For what purpose? Was it a warning, a joke, a mistake? I started noticing little things. My phone would buzz with no notifications. Random static on the line during calls. An odd delay when answering, like someone was listening before the line connected. Maybe it was just paranoia, but maybe not. The most unnerving part came a few days later. I was folding laundry, half watching the news, when a story came on about a series of local phone scams. People receiving calls from familiar numbers only to hear distorted voices or strange threats. Most dismissed it as pranks. Some said their numbers were being spoofed, but there was one detail that made me sit up straight. One woman described the voice she heard as wet, like it was being spoken underwater. That's when I knew I wasn't alone. That whatever had happened to me had happened to others. Maybe not the same message, maybe not the same timing, but the same presence, the same voice. I never found out who or what it was. The calls eventually stopped. Or maybe I just learned not to pick up unknown numbers anymore. But the memory has stayed with me, quiet and patient. It surfaces sometimes, when I'm in a cafe, when I hear the hum of a phone against a quiet afternoon. I'll glance around, suddenly aware of how exposed we all are, with our lives open and visible, waiting to be interrupted by a voice we don't recognize. And somewhere, in the back of my mind, I wonder if it will ever call again. Story 7. The light, the silence, and the whisper of something else. There are moments that arrive quietly but stay forever, not because they were loud or obvious, but because they touch something in you that nothing else ever has. I've lived with that kind of moment for years now. It came in the dark, in a bedroom that had always felt safe until it suddenly didn't, and it left behind a question I still don't know how to answer. Let me begin with where I live, Colorado, just outside the sprawl of Denver, in a neighborhood nestled beside a highway. Not far enough for silence, but far enough for the night to sometimes feel like it belongs only to the street lamps and the low, distant hum of passing cars. The kind of place where everything feels familiar, comfortable, safe. And yet, one night, something happened that stripped away that feeling entirely. It had been an ordinary day, nothing unusual. I was home, drifting through the late hours. I must have fallen asleep at some point, lost in dreams that vanished the moment I opened my eyes. What woke me was not a sound or a touch, but something deeper, an awareness, a pressure in the air. My eyes opened wide to the ceiling, and immediately I was alert. And then came the dread. It wasn't gradual. It didn't build. It arrived fully formed, like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I knew something was wrong. Every instinct screamed at me to get up, to run, to cry out. But just as strong, maybe stronger, was a second feeling. Do not move. It wasn't paralysis. I wasn't frozen. I could feel my limbs, my fingers, my toes. I could have moved if I wanted to. But I didn't want to. Something inside me whispered that I shouldn't, that moving would change things, that if I acknowledged what was happening by reacting, whatever was watching me would react in turn. I lay there still and silent as a strange light bloomed above me. It was geometric, square, made of smaller lights arranged in a perfect grid. It hovered about 3 feet above my body, perfectly aligned with my chest. It didn't move, didn't flicker. It just hovered there in the darkness, glowing with a soft but unnatural whiteness. And then I noticed something else. The silence. It was total, the kind of silence that only exists in dreams. My fan had stopped. The cars on the highway gone. No creaking of the house, no subtle ambient hum, just a deep, bottomless stillness. It felt like the whole world had been paused, like someone had muted reality itself. I wanted to scream, but the instinct to remain still was overpowering. I wanted to cry, but I was too afraid even to breathe too loudly, so I began to whisper. A child's whisper, desperate, trembling. I want to stay with my mum. I want to stay with my mum. Over and over, like a chant, as if those words could anchor me in a moment that felt like it didn't belong to the world I knew. And then, without warning, the light vanished. The fan began to hum again. The highway's distant sigh returned. The world slipped back into place with a gentle thud, like a train settling onto its tracks. And I felt an overwhelming sleepiness sweep over me, a bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to pull me under again. But in the fog of my mind, a single thought emerged. Whatever had just happened, it was already beginning to fade. The details were slipping even as I tried to cling to them. I knew that if I didn't do something right then, the memory would dissolve like mist. I turned on the lamp beside my bed, blinking against the sudden brightness, and began to cry. Quiet, aching tears. Not from sadness, but from the knowledge that something had happened, something real, and that the world would not understand. Later, when I told my sister, she was calm, reassuring. It was sleep paralysis, she said. You've had a lot of stress. Your body was asleep, but your mind woke up. That's all it was. But that's not what it was. I've had sleep paralysis before. I know what it feels like. The rigid stillness, the inability to speak or move, the heavy weight on your chest. This wasn't that. I could move, I just didn't. I wasn't trapped. I was afraid. And that light, that humming, silent light. I remember it with a clarity that no dream has ever given me. It wasn't imagined, it wasn't abstract, it was precise, symmetrical, real. For days afterward, I walked through my life like a shadow of myself. I tried to focus on work, on conversations, on everyday routines, but I couldn't stop thinking about the silence, about how utterly void it was, about the way it pressed into my ears, my skin, my soul, as if the world had blinked, as if something had slipped into that pause to observe me. And the most terrifying part wasn't what I saw, it was what I felt, the deep, unshakable certainty that it wasn't the first time, that I had experienced this before, many times maybe, that I had simply forgotten, each time erased, memory scrubbed clean by a force that didn't want to be known. But something had gone wrong this time. Something had slipped, and I had remembered, at least enough to be afraid. I started sleeping with a light on, the fan always running, my phone within reach. I changed my habits. No more falling asleep with the TV off, no more lying in bed without a podcast or background sound playing. I needed noise, movement, a tether to the world I recognized. The months passed. Nothing happened again. But the memory has never softened. Sometimes, when I wake in the middle of the night and find my room too quiet, I feel the edges of that old fear stir again. I listen for the fan, for the cars, for the breath of a world that is still turning, and I pray that the silence won't return. But even now, years later, I wonder, what would have happened if I had moved? Would it have left? Would it have reacted? Would I have disappeared completely? And perhaps most chilling of all, if I hadn't fought to remember, would I still think nothing had ever happened? Story 8. The Tinder girl who was never there. There's a certain fragility to digital trust. When we swipe right or left, when we send a message into a void and wait for a stranger's words to return to us, we pretend we know something about who they are, that their face, filtered and frozen, means anything more than pixels. But what happens when that thin line between the real and the unreal dissolves? What happens when the stranger's not just unknown, but unknowable? This story didn't happen to me, it came to me through a friend during one of those late night conversations that only happen when people feel safe enough, tired enough, or drunk enough to speak honestly. We had been sitting around telling scary stories, laughing at most of them, trying to outdo each other, and then Dee, our most grounded, rational, no-nonsense friend, cleared his throat and said, I don't believe in ghosts or anything, but my friend told me this once, and it still freaked me out. That got our attention. Dee's friend, we'll call him Jordan, had a habit of going on Tinder dates. He wasn't looking for love, just company. He wasn't careless, but he wasn't exactly cautious either. His dates were mostly uneventful, some fun, some awkward, some forgettable, but then came the girl. Jordan said she was quiet at first, shy. Her messages were short, polite, almost overly proper, but there was something intriguing about her. Her profile pictures were soft, almost nostalgic, not overly posed, just her smiling gently, standing in sunlight, no filters, no angles, just stillness. When they finally met in person, she looked just like her photos, maybe even more beautiful, but not in a way that demanded attention. It was a subtler beauty, one that made you lean in closer, made you want to understand her. They went for coffee, talked. She didn't say much about herself, but she asked a lot of questions. Not the usual, what do you do kind, but quieter ones. What makes you feel at home? What did you dream about when you were little? Jordan answered, a little caught off guard by the intimacy of it all. But it wasn't off-putting, it was gentle. They walked afterward. The night was cool, the streetlights painting gold on the pavement. That's when she said it. I don't want to go home tonight. Jordan asked why. She hesitated, looked down, then said, there's something wrong with my house. I don't feel safe there. Her voice was almost too calm, like she had rehearsed the line in her head 100 times before saying it. She didn't elaborate, just asked, very politely, if he would come home with her. Not for anything, she added quickly, just to be there, to sleep nearby. Jordan agreed. He wasn't the kind of guy to take advantage. He thought she might be going through something, anxiety maybe, trauma. He just wanted to help. The house was strange, not in any obvious way. It wasn't old or decrepit. It was actually fairly normal, clean, minimal, quiet. But it had an emptiness to it, like a hotel room that had never really been used. The kind of space where things should have memories, but don't. He felt it as soon as he stepped inside, that subtle hollowness, like the house was waiting for something. They sat on the couch for a while, talked a bit more, watched a movie. She curled up against one armrest, silent, calm. Jordan sat nearby. Eventually she offered him a blanket and said he could sleep in the bed if he wanted. It was a queen, plenty of space. She would take the couch if he preferred, but he insisted she take the bed. He'd just lie beside her, nothing else. They lay down, facing opposite directions. The room was quiet, no traffic sounds, no ticking clock, just the slow, steady breathing of two people trying to pretend they were asleep. At some point during the night, Jordan had to use the bathroom. He didn't want to wake her, so he moved slowly, quietly. The hallway was darker than he remembered. The house felt colder. He found the bathroom and finished quickly, not wanting to linger. As he stepped back into the hallway, he saw something that made him stop. A figure, just standing there, not moving, not speaking, just there. He thought it was her. "Hey," he said softly, "you okay?" The figure didn't answer. It turned, slowly, and began walking away, toward the far end of the hallway. It wasn't her. He felt that in his bones. It was too tall. The posture was wrong, and it moved like it wasn't walking so much as gliding just above the floor. Heart pounding, Jordan rushed back to the bedroom. She was gone. The bed was made perfectly. No indent where she had been, no warmth on the pillow, no sign that anyone had ever been there. He searched the entire house, every room, every closet. No sign of her, no pictures on the walls, no shoes by the door. Nothing in the fridge. The whole place felt like a stage set, furnished just enough to appear real, but hollow underneath. He grabbed his things and left. He didn't look back. For half an hour he drove with no destination, trying to shake the feeling that something had followed him, that something had watched him. He tried to convince himself he'd imagined it all, that maybe he had dreamed it, but the unease didn't leave him. When he got home, he opened Tinder. Her profile was gone. Not unmatched, not deleted. Gone, as if it had never existed. No message history, no record of their conversations, nothing. He tried searching for her by name. Nothing. He never saw her again. He told Dee the story a few weeks later, not right away, not when it was still raw, but after the fear had dulled into something quieter. He told it not as a warning, but as a confession, like someone admitting they'd seen something they weren't supposed to see. Dee believed him. Maybe not every detail, maybe not with full conviction, but enough to know that something had happened. And that's the version Dee told us that night. We were all quiet when he finished, no jokes, no eye rolls, just the silence that follows when a story touches something deeper. And then he added something else. I asked him later if he ever found the house again, like drove by the neighborhood, and he said no. He wasn't even sure how he got there. He'd followed GPS instructions, but when he looked through his history, the route wasn't saved. There was no record, like the drive itself didn't happen. That was when we all looked at each other, not with fear, but with that quiet, shared sense of unease. Because every one of us, in some small way, had trusted an app to bring a stranger into our lives. And now the question lingered, how much do we really know about the people we meet? The ones who smile softly from a profile picture, who say just the right things, who seem too perfect, too quiet, too empty. What if sometimes they were never real to begin with?